The body hung limp from a tree branch at the edge of the jungle clearing. 2 puncture wounds visible at the neck, skin drained to a waxy pallor in the moonlight. Philippine Army scouts found it just before dawn, on a humid morning in 1952, suspended above a dirt trail used by Hukbalahap insurgents, moving between safe houses in the Zambales Mountains. The corpse belonged to a rebel courier, a young man who had vanished from his patrol 3 nights earlier. His comrades had searched frantically, firing shots into the darkness, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. Now he had returned, emptied of blood, marked with the unmistakable signature of the Aswang, the vampire creature that every Filipino child learned to fear before sleep. The rebels, who discovered him, did not stay to cut him down. They fled into the deeper forest, whispering prayers, abandoning their positions along a supply route they had held for 18 months. Within a week, the entire sector had gone silent. The insurgents had melted away, surrendering their arms to government forces, or simply walking back to their villages, unwilling to face an enemy that hunted in the old ways, by the old rules, with the old hungers. No one claimed responsibility. No pamphlets explained the death. The body simply appeared, and an entire front collapsed. This was not folklore, resurrected by accident. It was psychological warfare engineered in Washington and executed in the mountains of Luzon, drawn from declassified files and public archives that reveal one of the Central Intelligence Agency's earliest experiments in cultural exploitation. The operation had no official name in the cables that authorized it, but the men who carried it out called it what it was, turning legend into weapon, superstition into strategy, and the collective memory of a people into a tool of counterinsurgency. What happened in those mountains would shape covert doctrine for decades, establishing principles that would reappear in jungles and deserts across the Cold War world, proving that the most effective weapons are often the ones that leave no visible wound, that strike not at the body, but at the imagination, at the stories we tell ourselves about what moves in the darkness and what it wants from us. The communist insurgency in the Philippines had been growing since the end of the Second World War, fed by land disputes, poverty, and the collapse of wartime resistance networks into peacetime banditry. The Hukbalahap, originally formed to fight the Japanese occupation, had evolved into a Marxist-Leninist movement, controlling vast stretches of central Luzon by 1950, fielding perhaps 15,000 fighters, and claiming the loyalty of hundreds of villages. The Philippine government, led by President Elpidio Quirino, was losing ground steadily, its army demoralized, and its rural authority dissolving under pressure from rebels who moved freely through terrain they knew intimately, collecting taxes, administering justice, and building the infrastructure of a parallel state. Manila was desperate. American policymakers watched with alarm, seeing in the Huk Rebellion a potential domino, another Southeast Asian nation sliding toward communist control. Just as China had fallen and as Korea burned, the stakes were existential for both governments, personal for the men caught between them, and abstract for the strategists in Langley, who saw an opportunity to test theories about influence and control that could not be explored in a conventional battlefield. The man who would architect the psychological dimension of the counterinsurgency was not a career intelligence officer, but an advertising executive turned Cold War operative. Edward Lansdale, a United States Air Force officer, assigned to the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, with a mandate to advise the Philippine military on unconventional tactics. Lansdale had studied anthropology and marketing before the war, disciplines that taught him how belief systems functioned, how narratives spread, and how fear could be engineered and directed with the same precision as a rifle shot. He arrived in Manila in 1950 with a small team and a conviction that the Huk Rebellion could not be defeated by firepower alone, that the real battle was for the emotional allegiance of the civilian population and the psychological resilience of the insurgents themselves. Lansdale understood that the Huks were not motivated solely by ideology or material grievance, but by a complex web of local loyalties, historical resentments, and cultural identities that had to be addressed on their own terms, in their own symbolic language, using the stories and images that already lived in the Filipino imagination. The Aswang occupied a central place in that imagination, particularly in rural Luzon, where the insurgency was strongest. The creature varied in its details across regions, sometimes appearing as a beautiful woman by day, who transformed into a predatory beast at night, sometimes as a ghoul that fed on corpses, sometimes as a vampire that drained the blood of the living through a proboscis-like tongue. The common thread was the creature's association with isolated places, with the jungle and the night, with the violation of the body and the disruption of community order. Parents invoked the Aswang to keep children indoors after dark. Villages held rituals to ward off its presence. The belief was not universal or literal among educated urbanites, but in the countryside it retained a visceral power, a residue of pre-colonial animism that had survived centuries of Christianization and existed alongside Catholic doctrine without contradiction, a parallel framework for explaining misfortune and danger. Lansdale recognized that this belief could be weaponized, that the Huks' own cultural background made them vulnerable to a specific kind of terror that Western insurgents would not feel, that by simulating the signs of Aswang activity, the CIA could trigger a panic that would drive rebels out of areas where conventional military pressure had failed. The first experiment was small and surgical, conducted in a Huk-controlled zone north of Manila, where intelligence indicated a rebel company was using a particular trail network for resupply. Lansdale's team, working with Philippine Army scouts, trained in special operations, identified a young insurgent who had been captured during a skirmish and whose body had been held in a military morgue. The plan was simple in concept and grotesque in execution. The body would be taken to the trail, punctured at the neck with a tool that mimicked fang marks, and drained of blood through an incision in the throat, then hung in a location where the Huks would find it during their next patrol. The blood would be collected and disposed of, leaving the corpse pale and shrunken, conforming to the visual expectations of an Aswang attack. No leaflets would be distributed, no claims would be made. The scene would speak for itself, relying on the insurgents' own interpretive framework to supply the narrative, to transform a calculated act of psychological manipulation into a supernatural event that required no external explanation because it fit so perfectly into the existing template of village horror stories. The operation was executed on a moonless night in late 1952. The team moved quietly, working quickly to position the body and withdraw before dawn, leaving no footprints or evidence of human involvement beyond the corpse itself. Lansdale later described the moment in his memoirs with a tone of detached professionalism, noting the precision required to create the puncture wounds at the correct angle and depth. The care taken to ensure the body appeared to have been exsanguinated naturally, rather than cut open. The importance of selecting a location that would be discovered at the right time by the right people. The team monitored the area from a distance, using binoculars and local informants, waiting to see how the Huks would respond. The reaction exceeded expectations. When the body was found, the insurgents did not investigate or attempt to retrieve it for burial. They abandoned their positions immediately, pulling back several kilometers and refusing to return despite orders from their commanders. Word of the incident spread through the rebel network within days, carried by deserters and messengers who described the scene in whispered conversations, each retelling amplifying the details, adding elements of supernatural malevolence that had not been present in the original staging. The Aswang had returned to the mountains, and it was hunting communists. Lansdale expanded the operation over the following months, repeating the technique in other Huk zones with similar results. Each staged incident was carefully calibrated to local folklore, with variations in the presentation to match regional beliefs. about how the Aswang behaved and what signs it left behind. In some areas, the bodies were found near water sources, reflecting the belief that Aswang feared running water and would leave victims nearby. In others, the puncture wounds were placed at the wrists or ankles, corresponding to variations in the legend about where the creature fed. The psychological impact was cumulative, creating a climate of dread that eroded morale and disrupted rebel operations, even in areas where no incidents had occurred. As rumors spread faster than facts, and insurgents began to attribute ordinary misfortunes, illnesses, and disappearances to supernatural causes, seeing patterns where none existed, and fleeing from shadows that held no enemy. The Philippine Army capitalized on the panic by increasing patrols in affected areas, reinforcing the impression that the mountains had become inhospitable for the Huks, that something had shifted in the balance of forces beyond the visible realm of guns and tactics. The mechanics of the operation required careful coordination between American advisors and Philippine military units, particularly the scouts, who possessed the cultural knowledge and linguistic fluency to move through rural areas without arousing suspicion. These men were drawn from the same regions as the insurgents, spoke the same dialects, understood the same stories, and could gauge how a particular staging would be received by a particular community. They were not told the strategic rationale for the missions, only the tactical objectives: transport the body, position it correctly, withdraw undetected, and report on the aftermath. Some of them expressed discomfort with the work, questioning whether it violated codes of conduct regarding the treatment of enemy dead, or whether it crossed ethical lines that should remain inviolate even in war. Lansdale addressed these concerns by framing the operation in utilitarian terms, arguing that the psychological tactic saved lives by reducing the need for direct combat, that frightening insurgents out of an area was preferable to killing them, and that exploiting cultural beliefs was no different in principle from exploiting terrain or weather conditions, simply another dimension of the battlefield that a competent strategist had to consider and manipulate. The argument was not universally persuasive, but it was sufficient to maintain operational discipline and ensure the missions continued. The financial cost of the operation was minimal compared to conventional military campaigns. The primary expenses were logistical transportation for the teams, payments to informants who provided intelligence on rebel movements, and salaries for the scouts who executed the stagings. There were no expensive weapons systems, no aerial bombardments, no infrastructure projects. The psychological operation ran parallel to larger American aid programs that funneled millions of dollars into the Philippine military, supplying equipment, training, and advisory support. But the vampire tactic itself required only human labor and cultural knowledge, making it extraordinarily cost-effective as a force multiplier. Lansdale reported the results up the chain of command with detailed metrics: square kilometers cleared of insurgent presence, number of rebels who surrendered or deserted, reduction in Huk attacks in affected zones. The data suggested that the operation was achieving strategic objectives at a fraction of the cost of conventional approaches, validating the hypothesis that psychological warfare could alter battlefield dynamics in ways that kinetic force could not, particularly in conflicts where the enemy was embedded in the population and where civilian perceptions determined the flow of intelligence, supplies, and recruits. The Huk leadership struggled to counteract the Aswang panic, issuing directives that dismissed the incidents as superstition and enemy propaganda, urging fighters to remain disciplined and rational, to reject feudal beliefs that contradicted Marxist materialism. Commanders held meetings in jungle camps, where they tried to explain the stagings as psychological operations, arguing that the bodies were being manipulated by American and Philippine forces to sow fear, that there were no vampires in the mountains, only soldiers doing their jobs. The explanations were technically correct, but emotionally unpersuasive. Ideology could not erase instincts forged in childhood, memories of stories told by grandmothers, fears that lived deeper than political conviction. Some insurgents accepted the materialist analysis intellectually, but still felt the visceral dread when they passed through darkened trails or heard unexplained sounds in the night. Others rejected the leadership's reassurances entirely, convinced that the Aswang was real and that Marxism offered no protection against forces that predated the revolution, that belonged to a different order of reality entirely. The ideological crisis weakened unit cohesion and created rifts between educated urban cadres who dismissed the folklore and rural fighters who could not. By 1953, the Hukbalahap was in steep decline, not solely because of the Aswang operation, but because of a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy that combined military pressure, land reform, amnesty programs, and psychological warfare into a coordinated campaign. The government, advised by Lansdale and supported by American aid, had regained the initiative, reclaiming territory, fragmenting rebel networks, and offering insurgents a path back to civilian life that many accepted. The Aswang tactic played a role in this reversal, particularly in the early phase, when momentum was shifting and when small psychological victories could cascade into larger strategic gains. The exact number of insurgents who fled or surrendered specifically because of the staged vampire incidents is impossible to quantify, entangled as it was with other factors. But operational reports from the period credit the technique with clearing multiple zones that had resisted conventional assaults, with creating safe corridors for government forces, and with demonstrating that cultural knowledge could be as valuable as firepower in asymmetric conflicts. The operation remained classified for decades, hidden in archives that were not open to researchers, until the Cold War had ended and the participants had aged into retirement or death. Lansdale wrote about it obliquely in his memoirs, published in the 1970s, describing the psychological tactics without detailing the specific mechanics of the vampire stagings, framing the work as a necessary innovation in a brutal conflict where conventional rules did not apply and where the alternative to manipulation was prolonged bloodshed. His account sparked debate among historians and ethicists about the boundaries of acceptable conduct in unconventional warfare, about whether exploiting cultural beliefs constituted a violation of human dignity, and about whether the ends achieved in the Philippines justified the means employed. Some scholars argued that the operation represented a kind of cultural imperialism, a manipulation of indigenous belief systems by foreign operatives who treated Filipino folklore as a tool rather than a living tradition deserving respect. Others defended it as a pragmatic response to a genuine threat, noting that the Huks themselves used propaganda and intimidation to maintain control over villages, that war necessarily involves deception, and that psychological tactics are preferable to kinetic violence when they achieve the same objectives with less loss of life. The documents declassified in subsequent years revealed the extent of the operation and its influence on later CIA doctrine. The Aswang tactic became a case study in psychological operations courses taught to intelligence officers as an example of how cultural anthropology could be applied to covert action, how understanding the target population's worldview allowed for interventions that were both subtle and devastating. The principles established in the Philippines, the integration of cultural exploitation into counterinsurgency strategy, reappeared in later conflicts where American forces faced irregular enemies embedded in complex social landscapes. The specific tactic of staging supernatural events was not replicated widely, given its dependence on particular cultural contexts, but the underlying logic, the idea that perception management could be as decisive as firepower, became foundational to Cold War strategy and continues to shape contemporary approaches to influence operations, information warfare, and the manipulation of belief systems for strategic ends. The Philippine government, in the years after the Huk defeat, constructed a narrative of the conflict that emphasized military prowess and political reform, downplaying the role of American advisors and the more controversial aspects of the counterinsurgency campaign. The Aswang operation was not mentioned in official histories or commemorated in monuments. Veterans of the conflict, both former insurgents and government soldiers, rarely spoke publicly about the psychological tactics, treating them as embarrassing episodes better forgotten, as moments when fear had overridden reason and when the war had descended into a realm where the boundaries between reality and myth had blurred beyond recognition. In the villages where the incidents occurred, the stories persisted as local legends, retold by elders who insisted they had seen the signs themselves or knew someone who had, the details shifting with each generation until the CIA's involvement was lost entirely, replaced by the simpler, older narrative of the Aswang returning to punish those who had strayed from the path, who had taken up arms and disrupted the order of things. The human cost of the operation is difficult to assess from the available records. The bodies used in the stagings were those of insurgents already dead, killed in combat, or executed after capture, meaning the tactic itself did not directly cause additional deaths. The indirect effects, the psychological trauma inflicted on those who witnessed the scenes or heard the stories, cannot be quantified, but were undoubtedly real, shaping how individuals processed the violence of the conflict and how communities remembered the insurgency years. Some former Huks, interviewed decades later by researchers, described the Aswang incidents as turning points in their decision to leave the movement, moments when the war stopped making sense, when the ideological certainty that had sustained them through hardship crumbled under the weight of a fear they could not rationalize away. Others expressed bitterness at having been manipulated, at discovering years later that the supernatural events they had fled from were manufactured by intelligence operatives who had studied their culture specifically to find its pressure points, its vulnerabilities, the stories it used to explain the inexplicable. Lansdale left the Philippines in 1953, moving on to other assignments where he would apply the lessons learned in the mountains of Luzon to new contexts, new enemies, new populations. He carried with him a reputation as a master of unconventional warfare, a strategist who understood that winning hearts and minds required more than propaganda leaflets and aid programs, that it demanded a willingness to enter the psychological landscape of the target population, to manipulate the symbols and narratives that structured their understanding of reality, to become, in effect, a kind of sorcerer who could conjure fear and hope with equal facility. His career would take him to Vietnam, where he would advise the Saigon government on counterinsurgency, and to Cuba, where he would participate in efforts to destabilize the Castro regime, always bringing the same philosophy, the same conviction that perception was a weapon and that culture was a battlefield as real as any physical terrain. The Aswang operation stands as a testament to the inventiveness and ruthlessness of Cold War intelligence work, a reminder that the conflict between superpowers was fought not only with nuclear arsenals and proxy armies, but with carefully crafted illusions, with the deliberate manipulation of belief systems, and with a willingness to exploit the most intimate fears of populations caught in the crossfire. It reveals the extent to which American strategists were prepared to go to secure influence in the developing world, how thoroughly they studied the societies they sought to shape, and how little regard they sometimes showed for the autonomy and dignity of the people whose minds they were attempting to control. The operation succeeded in its immediate tactical objectives, clearing rebel zones and weakening insurgent morale, but its legacy is more ambiguous, raising questions about the ethics of psychological manipulation, about the long-term consequences of weaponizing culture, and about what it means for a nation to win a war by turning people's deepest fears against them. In the museums and archives, where the documents now rest, available to researchers and historians, the Aswang operation appears as a footnote to larger Cold War narratives, a curious detail in the long chronicle of covert actions, proxy wars, and ideological struggles that defined the second half of the 20th century. But for those who lived through it, who found bodies drained of blood at the edge of jungle clearings, or who fled into the night, convinced that something ancient and hungry had awakened in the mountains, the operation was not a footnote. It was the moment when the war stopped being about politics and land reform and revolutionary ideology, when it became instead a confrontation with forces that belonged to nightmare rather than history, when the modern world revealed its willingness to summon the old terrors in service of new conflicts, proving that in the end, the most sophisticated weapon systems, the most advanced technologies, the most refined theories of counterinsurgency, all pale beside the simple, brutal effectiveness of fear itself, wielded with precision and cultural knowledge against an enemy who never expected the stories of childhood to return as instruments of war. The takeaway is not that psychological operations are uniquely American or uniquely Cold War phenomena, but that they represent a permanent feature of human conflict, a recognition that battles are won not only on physical terrain, but in the contested space of belief, memory, and imagination. The Aswang operation succeeded because it understood its audience completely, because it spoke in a language older than ideology, because it tapped into fears that existed before the insurgency began and would persist after it ended. That understanding, that willingness to map the psychological landscape as carefully as the physical one, to identify the pressure points where culture becomes vulnerable to manipulation, remains the foundation of influence operations today, even as the tools and targets evolve. The lesson the CIA learned in the mountains of the Philippines was simple and enduring. If you know what someone fears in the darkness, you can become that fear, and in becoming it, you can move them in any direction you choose, away from loyalty, away from conviction, away from the fight they thought they believed in, until nothing remains but the instinct to flee from shadows that were always, from the beginning, under your control.